Thank you very much. I'm glad to introduce. My name is Michael Irwin. I'm very happy to introduce Stephen Smagula to the department. He's a friend and colleague from the University of Pittsburgh. Stephen is, before he was appointed at the University of Pittsburgh, he obtained his PhD from the School of Public Health at the University of Pittsburgh, and then migrated over to psychiatry and was in the geropsychiatry laboratory working in late life mood disorder research, and also then migrated to the Center for Sleep and Circadian Science at the University of Pittsburgh and for a second tier of his fellowship training. He's been appointed at the University of Pittsburgh for several years now. He's currently an associate professor. Steve is very committed and interested in the relationships between sleep and particularly sleep-wake disruption on health outcomes, with a particular focus on mental health outcomes and depression. Because of his training in late life mood disorder research, he's also considered a leading expert in the treatment of depression in older adults in this country. In the last 10 years, he's been very prolific of publishing in many papers, over 75 papers in top tier journals, JAMA Psychiatry, Molecular Psychiatry, and of course, American Journal of Geriatric Psychiatry, as well as Sleep. He's been the recipient of many awards as well. Importantly, at the University of Pittsburgh, as part of his PhD, School of Public Health, he received an Early Career Excellence Award, and has also received an award from the American Association for Geriatric Psychiatry called the Barry Leibowitz Early Career Award. He's currently examining behavioral approaches, and I have the opportunity to work with him closely on a study that he and I and others are doing, examining the ability to reduce depression and prevent suicide in older adults. So it's really a delight to welcome Stephen to University of California, Los Angeles, and to our particular grounds, and hear from him firsthand about his research which will evaluate targeting sleep-wake behaviors to reduce the burden of depression in older adults. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'd like to thank also my mentors and funders. What I present today will not necessarily represent the official views of the funders. I also want to note that I founded a startup so that I could develop activity monitoring technology. This is no longer ineligible. It is inactive, but it is something I'll note with this symbol. So just to dive in, here's my outline. In terms of the background, I don't need to tell such an audience as this, but I will. Depression symptoms are very common. In older adults, they're 2 to 3 times more common than disorders. Prevalence estimates, if you look in the literature, they really vary quite widely. For example, moderate to severe depression symptoms, depending on the sample, you'll get 5 to 20%. And this varies by where you're sampling and the risk factors that are associated there. So you'll get more when you have people, older adults who have medical comorbidities. And in an institute like ours or like yours, 1 in 5 are going to have some depression symptoms. So incredibly common. We want to treat depression, not just because depression is detrimental to quality of life, but also to reduce related outcomes. There may be causal relationships between having and living with depression, with several outcomes such as dementia and early mortality, as well as suicide death. So if we want to think about how to treat depression, we have to think about pharmacotherapy, of course. It's the most common depression treatment, and the STAR*D trial completed 2 decades ago enrolled individuals with major depression and treated them in up to 5 steps, where 12 weeks of pharmacotherapy, and if you did not remit, you would be advanced to the next step to switch to another medicine or add something. So unlike most depression treatment out of a family medicine or a PCP, there was intensive symptom monitoring, 5 visits for each step. That's pretty intensive monitoring. And the doctors here, they were not vending machines. They followed rigorous dosing guidelines and used the maximum tolerable dose as the goal. Again, not something you're always going to see in the real world. So what they get after the first step, about a quarter had remitted. More remitted, the more you stayed in treatment. However, there were some diminishing returns here. So I think it's important to keep this access at 100% here and to realize this might be superior to placebo, but still many patients are not responding or remitting. You might think, oh, we have new treatments now, and oh, what about CBT? Still, if we think about wanting to have 100% respond or remit, we can see while CBT is efficacious and CBT plus pharmacotherapy may be better in the long term than just one or the other, we do still see in the 30–40% having remission. So major questions remain. What are the unmet needs of patients? For the treatments that work, how are they working? What can that teach us? And then, of course, there's a great challenge, although efficacious treatments exist, matching patients to treatments that work. The question of for whom a treatment works remains unaddressed satisfactorily. So, as my title and Dr. Irwin mentioned, my focus has been on sleep-wake disruption as a potential unmet need in people with depression. We know insomnia is the most common sleep complaint. If you ask people about their sleep, people with depression over 90% are going to report some significant sleep problem. Insomnia is the most common, but many people actually have insomnia and hypersomnia. Um, and so this has been long established, and actually, the first prospective epidemiologic study investigating relations between sleep and depression is over 30 years ago now. And what they showed here was that depression was not just correlated with concurrent depression, but I'm sorry, sleep-wake disruption was not just correlated with concurrent depression. If you had insomnia or developed insomnia, you were more likely to develop depression in the future. And this paper by Ford and Camero also pointed out that if you had hypersomnia or developed hypersomnia, you were more likely to develop depression in the future. And so this is not new. Dr. Reynolds commented on this back in the late 80s that there's a great potential here and that the principles of sleep hygiene should be taught. Perhaps most importantly is teaching the regularity of the morning wake time, and that some patients may benefit from modest sleep restriction, which creates a sleep debt and leads to greater sleep continuity. And so, further randomized studies needed. And this was back in the late 80s. I'm very, very happy to be getting into this area when we've really had some great progress here. Specifically, Dr. Irwin's study published in JAMA Psychiatry a few years back, where they enrolled almost 300 individuals, or they randomized almost 300 individuals who had insomnia. About half got the first line treatment for insomnia, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, and the others got a control. And the findings showed that over time, those who got the treatment for insomnia were less likely to have a new or recurrent episode of depression. So this is really, I think, a landmark study to show half the risk of a episode of depression in people with insomnia if you treat it. My work has really centered around using actigraphy to understand these relationships. And I think actigraphy is a great tool. It's passive, it can be put on the wrist, and people just generally forget about it and wear it. And it gives you back data like this, where each dot is a 30-second epoch, and you can see when Jim here is active, midnight, 6 a.m., noon, and so on. And these are 7 consecutive days, and I've stacked them on top of each other so that you can see Jim tends to be sleeping from about 11 or 12 at night till 6. And in the day, he tends to be active. And this follows a pattern, a pretty, very robust, regular pattern. In contrast, other individuals have quite irregular patterns that are really evident when you when you use actigraphy. So, for example, who I'm calling Bob here is up a lot at night, sometimes napping during the day, daytime inactivity, sleeping at odd times, and not really organized in a regular 24-hour rhythm. Now, sleep-wake rhythms in particular appear to be important to mood in older adults. This is a study from Pai et al., which showed in a sample of individuals with depression and healthy controls, the groups with depression had less regular 24-hour sleep-wake rhythms and disrupted activity patterns. But in this sample, they found no differences in measures of total sleep time, timing, or number of awakenings. There are also experimental studies which highlight the importance of rhythms to mood. So in this protocol, they used something called the forced dysynchrony protocol, where you set people on a 28-hour day. Your internal 24 or about 24-hour clock can't match up to that, and so it's hence the desynchrony part. So here you can see a diagram showing these 28-hour days and what it does to the sleep-wake timing relative to a 24-hour clock. And if you do this to people, you disrupt their rhythms through this protocol, they report reduced positive mood, increased hostility, and increased negative affect. So that might sound like some patients that you've seen. Another way of doing this would be to simulate shift work. For example, an extreme 12-hour shift. Here, the black bars are when they're sleeping in this protocol. Nice 11 till 7. That sounds great. And then all of a sudden, down here, you're shifting the sleep period 12 hours as a shift worker might do. Again, this is impairing mood and reducing well-being. And so, to summarize the background here, sleep-wake rhythm disruption may not just be a consequence of depression, it may contribute to exacerbate episodes, lead to recurrence if it's left untreated. There are also separate literatures just looking at the relationship of sleep-wake disruption, not with depression, but with all these things that we think depression might be worsening the risk of, like dementia. So if we could treat sleep-wake rhythm disruption, maybe this would reduce depression and the related poor outcomes. But that really just begs the question of, well, sleep-wake rhythm disruption is not just one thing. Many things go into it. What should we be targeting and how should we do it? And that brings me to the first section where I want to present some data, particularly focusing on stressed dementia caregivers. This was my Career Development Award from the NIMH, which was squarely around the onset of COVID in March of 2020. And so the goals of this study were to examine associations of sleep-wake factors measured with actigraphy with depression symptoms in caregivers over time. We also we integrated MRI-based brain biomarkers to understand which MRI markers might be related to both sleep-wake disruption and depression symptoms to give us some neurobiological context. Of course, it's very plausible. This isn't new. A lot of people acknowledge that sleep-wake disruption occurs in dementia caregivers. For one, caregivers are under a lot of stress, and stress may lead to hyperarousal, which is thought to be the chief cause of insomnia. Not just, having trouble shutting your brain off, some caregivers might actually be woken up at night to deliver care. And there's this idea of the dementia caregiver as someone who's just constantly going, doesn't get a break. Caregivers may not be able to go out and about and do the things that they enjoy during the day due to their caregiving role. So this combination of increased activity at night and decreased activity during the day may dampen or affect the rhythm. But when I was starting this work, there were some actigraphy studies in caregivers, but none that looked at the relationship of actigraphy sleep with depression. And so we wanted to ask this question in this potential cycle of relating sleep and depression. Sleep-wake disruption can come in many forms, insults to satisfaction like complaints, poor efficiency, duration, timing, and regularity. Which of these factors were relevant to mood in this group? We actually enrolled because we wanted to do a prospective study. We focused on caregivers who were in the mild to no depression range. That is, they did not have moderate to severe depression based on the PHQ. And again, this was because we were hopeful that we could see the incidence of depression over time. The sample, when it came time to do analyses, COVID was hitting and it was really affecting our ability to keep enrolling people. So when we were at 56, we had about an average age of 71, about 70% female. And yeah, so depression symptoms in the mild range. And what we wanted to do was, so remember, all of these caregivers reported some stress or strain related to caregiving. And we did clustering on the depression scales at baseline. That was the first thing we looked at. And we were able to detect a group of caregivers, about 40% of the sample, who had really minimal to no depression. So because they had stress from caregiving, but they were reporting like really low symptoms of depression, we considered this to be like our resilient depression resilient group, whereas others were having the stress of caregiving, reporting that, plus they were having some mild symptoms here. You can see PHQ-9 scores and CSD scores on average kind of in the mild range. So the first thing we did with actigraphy is we plotted their hourly activity levels in both groups, in the minimal to no symptom group, and then in the group with depression symptoms. And yeah, there was this little bit where the caregivers with some depression symptoms were a little bit more active at night, potentially reflecting some additional sleep fragmentation. But there was just this large effect size difference from 8 till 10 in the morning, where the caregivers with depression symptoms were simply just less active in the morning. That's a small sample, so we wanted to go and see if we found similar trends, patterns in a larger sample of over 4,000 people who contributed accelerometer data in the NHANES. And here we were able to look at the kind of full range of depression, at least fuller range of depression symptoms, so including moderate to severe depression versus not. And when you look at those same sort of plots, we stratified by age group here, and don't ask me what's going on with the younger adults in this sample. I don't know. But there were no differences in activity levels among younger adults with and without depression. But once you were above the age of 30, it was clear that the individuals with depression were on average less active. And furthermore, there was a disproportionate amount of inactivity that occurred before noon. So the time before noon is um, maybe about a third or a quarter of the active hours of the day, but they were getting about half of their activity deficit before noon. So those were all just cross-sectional associations. So going back to my Career Development Award, my K data, we took all of the things that were different about the caregivers with depression symptoms at baseline. That is, the caregivers with depression symptoms at baseline were not only less active in the morning, they did report more insomnia. They did report more sleep fragmentation, or on the actigraphy detected more sleep fragmentation. They reported more activity restriction and so on. And this bottom one is a measure of medical comorbidity. So the caregivers with depression symptoms at baseline had worse medical comorbidity. So if you put all these things in a model and you say which of these are associated with the degree of change over 6 months in symptoms, it was just the deficits in activity in the morning hours. Another way of looking at that, again, reminding you this sample was really in the moderate depression symptom range. Those with less morning activity had symptoms that tended to stay there. Those with more morning activity had symptoms that tended to go away. And we got the same result if instead of using actigraphy morning activity, you just asked them when they got up, when they got out of bed, or what degree are they a morning type. So again, this is a very small sample of caregivers here, about 50, 60 of them. But in a large epidemiologic study, we found consistency where if you reported being a morning type, the rates of MDD incidence were lower compared to both intermediate types and evening types. So there's some protection potentially against depression in individuals who are morning types. And we had our MRI data, and so we asked ourselves, what is it about morningness that seems to be protecting these caregivers about depression symptoms? What we did for this is we compared the morning types and the non-morning type caregivers in terms of their brain connectivity, and we at rest. So this is a resting state MRI scan, and we placed seeds in regions that had been previously linked with depression from prior studies. So, for example, we compared the resting state connectivity of the posterior cingulate with the rest of the brain between caregivers that were morning types and non-morning types. We did that with 4 seeds. Ventral anterior insula, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and amygdala. And so the morning types and the non-morning type caregivers, which we knew differed on depression, they also differed on this resting state connectivity feature. And this is the connectivity of the amygdala with the ventral posterior cingulate. The morning types had lower connectivity of the amygdala and the ventral PCC. Thinking about what these structures do, I think about the amygdala being involved in stress and fear and escape responses. The ventral PCC is an important node of what's called the default mode network. And this ventral portion has been shown previously to be involved when people are thinking about their duties and responsibilities. So this got me thinking, I don't want my amygdala and my ventral PCC too connected when I'm just resting and doing nothing. And it made me speculate, it made us speculate, maybe these caregivers are spinning their wheels. Maybe they're ruminating. So this maybe is a marker of behaviorally disengaged, emotion-focused coping or rumination. That's speculative, but it was consistent with some of these reports. This was a K award with repeated neuroimaging, and so not a big budget. I was doing a lot of these interviews, and I would love to ask caregivers, like, tell me what's most important to you in terms of your mood? What's affecting you the most? What's protecting you the most? You just tell me. And some of them would volunteer things like more than one. Like, yeah, I'm lingering around in bed. One even said, I can feel my distress. I know I'm doing it. It makes my distress boil up, but I'm doing it anyway. In contrast, others were reporting like really loving their morning routines and that they would get up and they would get going, and that, this engagement in the morning was really a key thing for them and their wellness. The other thing to note is that sleep architecture, that is the amount of time you're spending in each type of sleep, it varies, it's stereotyped. It's controlled by homeostatic and circadian forces, such that the first third of your night, you're getting a lot of your deep sleep. By the early morning hours, you're really alternating between REM sleep, brief awakenings, and light sleep. And now, if you throw in stress into the mix, and you throw in lingering in bed and trying to sleep after an initial awakening, you're likely going to get fragmented REM sleep that's broken up because of the stress you're waking up. Whereas consolidated REM sleep has been associated with damping down amygdala activity overnight. If you have a stressor, you have an amygdala response, and you get restless REM sleep, this very nice study by Rick Wassi and Usven Summerin showed that you had continued amygdala reactivity in the context of restless REM sleep. So we put this all together in a model, which basically states that the line from the stresses of being a caregiver to depression and distress is not a straight line, but it actually acts through individual variability. In particular, one factor may be that morning inactivation may be related to ruminative processes that can be measured on multiple levels of analysis, including with imaging. And of course, what we really care about is, can we do something about this? And we thought that there would be great benefits to increasing morning activation in people who were struggling to get going in the morning. They would have, if you're doing something fun in the morning habitually, you have less time to wake up and just focus on if your life sucks. So you could also potentially improve sleep. One of the cornerstones of behavioral sleep medicine treatments is setting a regular wake time that's sufficiently early that you build up sleep drive. You might also eliminate some fragmented REM sleep. Doing more rewarding activities could increase exposure to reward and improve outlook. And light exposure in the morning may also have direct effects on mood and also help stabilize circadian rhythms. So we thought about different ways to do this, and we landed on a behavioral activation approach called Engage Therapy, developed by George Alexopoulos and Pat Arian. In Engage Therapy, it was designed to be easier to train the therapists than problem-solving therapy. It includes 9 sessions, one per week, where you are making lists of rewarding activities and developing plans to increase engagement with reward. It has been shown to effectively increase behavioral activation and reduce depression. We took it and we wanted to target so that we'll increase activation in the morning based on all the stuff I just said. We also anticipated that caregivers might tell us, no, you don't understand. I'm really sleepy. I'm stressed. I'm sleepy. I need my sleep in the morning. And so we added educational material arguing and kind of showing some evidence that if you are more engaged in activity, people who do that tend to have better sleep, and explaining the mechanisms why. We also had some adaptations you can see in that paper after the fact when we enrolled people. But in the pilot, we ended up with 13 that got the kind of final version of it. We gave it for 9 weeks, and we were able to reduce the levels of self-reported morning activation deficits by about 50%. But you can see the individuals here, there was quite variability. Some people responded super well and early, some people responded less so. But on average, we're getting these nice improvements in morning activation. In terms of depression, we also saw improvements in depression. 62% of this tiny sample had what we would call depression treatment response. But again, this was just a really small pilot study. There was no control group. I don't know if this all just happened because they liked talking to the therapist Avital. We didn't have a control. We weren't able to probe mechanism. We can't tell if this changed brain activation. And certainly we can't tell why some people responded better than others with this small sample. So we have an ongoing study now where we are trying to replicate our findings, essentially. Pre-post imaging, we decided 6 weeks was probably enough of a dose. And so that's underway right now. Our primary outcomes are increasing morning activation and reducing rumination, including in response to an MRI task. Okay, so that's my first big section. I have another big section and then a tiny little ditty at the end. So this next section is moving on to a separate population. Specifically older adults who are at high risk for suicide. If you look in the literature for decades now, and increasingly, observational studies show various sleep-wake factors are associated with measures of suicidality. I mean, I can't think of one sleep-wake factor that somebody hasn't correlated with suicidality in some population, in some sample. And I was particularly interested in what are the sleep-wake factors related to suicidal ideation in older adults with MDD, just simply because, they may be different in kids with PTSD versus older adults with MDD, so on. And based on the literature, this was our hypothetical model and depicting our hypotheses that there would be a role of short sleep duration and sleep-wake rhythm disruption, independent effects of these two factors, independent correlations of them with suicidal ideation. This was a R21 target identification study. We were trying to enroll people with MDD plus another suicide risk factor, follow like a past attempt or current ideation, follow them, and this is a naturalistic study, just observe them, measure their ideation levels and their mood every week. They wore the actigraph for 6 weeks, and we followed them again up to 12 weeks later to track their suicidal ideation. When we're getting the actigraphy data back, we were seeing really, really high levels of sleep-wake disruption in this sample, which made sense because they were depressed and had additional suicide risk. So, for example, we were seeing a lot of short sleep. This night was very short, and some disorganization of daytime activity, sleep fragmentation. But it got worse. I mean, we were having patients coming in and we were seeing data that looked like this, where if I didn't tell you this was a sleep-wake rhythm and these were different days, you wouldn't discern it. There is no 24-hour organization to this individual's sleep. It's just kind of all over the place. They're having short sleep, maybe insomnia, maybe late timing. Sometimes they're very inactive for long stretches. These are very low levels of activity across the whole recording. And then sometimes we would see like 2-hour naps at 6 o'clock at night. And so we wanted to analyze. We were able to get 30 people into this small study. You can see moderate to severe depression, clinically significant levels of suicidal ideation measured with the Beck SSI. Mostly female sample, very, very few men made it in this sample. And so we wanted to see rhythm variables, sleep duration, sleep fragmentation, which were related to SI, and were they still related to SI after adjusting for depression. And what we found were if you had stronger rhythms and longer sleep, you had lower suicidal ideation scores. But only the rhythm variables were correlated with ideation after adjusting for depression. And so when you look back at this individual's actogram and you think about those findings, it says to me that if we really want to target sleep to prevent suicide, it's probably not just the insomnia we need to be thinking about, but also the daytime dysfunction and the overall rhythm loss. Again, that was what we had shown correlated with worse suicidal ideation. And so Dr. Bicey, my mentor and colleague, pointed me to the TRAN-SC approach, the Transdiagnostic Intervention for Sleep and Circadian Dysfunction. Here's the book. It's the treatment manual. Professor Harvey and Bicey, they had developed this program specifically it includes CBTI, but it also addresses rhythms and daytime dysfunction and timing shifts. And so it was designed specifically for this purpose of treating the multitude of sleep-wake problems we find in people with mental illness. Dr. Harvey allowed me to use her data from 35 older adults with serious mental illness. There were younger adults in the study too. We stratified by age. In the older adults, there were 35 of them. They had moderate depression. They were selected based on having serious mental illness. Um, and these were people getting care in a community mental health care center. They were either got treatment as usual or the active sleep approach. And in terms of their depression symptom responses, post-treatment, it was pretty poor. Remember, these are research, this is a research study, but it's being delivered in a community mental health care. So pretty real world and low rates of response, pretty similar between the groups. But the thing that stood out was 6 months after treatment, if you responded to TRAN-SC, you did not have recurrence, whereas the treatment as usual responses tended to go away. There was recurrence. In terms of suicidal ideation, we only had one measure, an item on the kids. About 30% reported some ideation at baseline, and could have just been passive death wish. Again, this secondary analysis. But after treatment, the TRAN-SC group had reductions in suicidal ideation that were sustained versus kind of lesser reductions in treatment as usual that were not sustained. And so I'm very, very grateful that I was able to snag Professor McCall and Professor Irwin based on their past work in this area to help me develop and deploy this now very large trial. I'm sorry, this is an outdated slide. I missed it. This was funded and it started in this past September, and we're getting ready to enroll people, including at your site. We're hoping to enroll 140 people per site. They'll get randomized to get TRAN-SC plus treatment as usual. They have to have at least the minimum adequate dose of depression pharmacotherapy. Um, and then they compare that to a rigorous active listening control with the goal of confirming that the TRAN-SC intervention leads to more sustained depression responses. And so we have secondary outcomes of preventing suicide behavior composite measure as well as reducing suicidal ideation. I really wanted this large sample, not just to examine mechanism in terms of the behavioral mechanism. We'll look to see if those sleep-wake changes we think mediate the response, but to identify for whom this approach works. So we're looking for people that have moderate to severe depression plus another suicide risk factor despite pharmacotherapy. So please keep us in mind. So that trial's ongoing. As I mentioned, I just have a little bit left, and then I hope that you will all have some questions for me. The last part, I just couldn't help but not share because it's very exciting, it has to do with monitoring rhythms in the real world. So related to what we're talking about, sleep-wake risk factors are kind of established in observational studies. We might be arguing or debating back and forth which one is the largest effect size, what's the best way to measure the rhythm. But in general, we know sleep-wake disruption is a risk factor. If we could measure these in the real world at scale, we could use this in screening, much like we screen other metrics. I think that the objective actigraphy data can help us tailor our treatments and really track and adapt our approaches based on behavioral data from actigraphy. So why aren't we doing this currently? I know there have been some innovations with like online platforms for research actigraphy lately, but in general, the approach is still you take a device, you plug it into the researcher's computer, you set it up, you give it to the participant, maybe mail it to them, they wear it, they give it back to you, you plug it back into your computer, you go through this proprietary software where then you get your epic by epic data, you model like those plots I was showing you, and at the end of the day, I could tell you your interdaily stability is 0.6, and like me and like a few dozen other people know what that mean, right? So this is not something that we're doing at scale. This is not something that we're doing in practice, even though we know these sleep-wake measures seem to have prognostic relevance. So you might think, well, consumer wearables are very popular. Why don't we just use them? Yes, I agree. But there's a gap here because they aren't measuring rhythms. You might say, well, you could just look at people's steps and go from there, but steps underestimate light activity, which is a really important source of activity, especially for older adults. And then another problem is Apple or Google could change their algorithm at any time. So that makes it hard to do research with it or set up practice guidelines. And your patient might come to you and say, my Fitbit says this or my Apple Watch says that, but there you'd have to develop a whole software anyway in order to like look at that and track their data remotely, like through a clinician dashboard. So over the last 8 years or so, I've been working to develop a system to get the raw accelerometer data from the Apple Watch. And this is just depicting the data comes from the watch to the phone. It then gets transmitted to Amazon Web Services where we do calculations, and there's a clinician dashboard. This is what the app looks like when you open it up. Um, That's kind of tricky to make sure you get enough data from people. So you have to ask them to actually wear the watch and keep it charged and things like that. It's a little trickier than just giving them a research device that can last 2 weeks and then getting it back. So we developed this star system that is sufficient, kind of an MVP for collecting the data. The stars fill up as the data comes in, and the goal we tell them is to get on a streak. So we tried to gamify it where they get, 3 green stars. And if you do that, you have 3 days of good data. We will then give you your scores. You can turn this off if you want. You just want to collect the data, or you can give them the feedback. So this will appear on their phone with graphs and plots. So you can see here periods of time of aerobic activity, pretty regular morning wake time, and some periods of missing data. Here's the clinician dashboard where you can see your participants' data, you can see where they're missing data, and these are plotting weeks, so that's a day, a night, and so on. We've piloted this in several different samples at this point. This one was just accepted last week for publication in JMIR Aging. We deployed it to people with MCI and older adults with healthy cognition, and we were able to get about a week of data from everybody like we asked. Some people in the MCI group, 2 people in the MCI group one person got 3 days, one person got 5 days of data. But everybody got enough to at least get some assessment of their sleep-wake pattern. And the sleep-wake rhythms measures that we got from this system correlated with cognitive function as similar to as we would have expected if we used research actigraphs. Here are the data from that study. A person on the top with a more consolidated rhythm, and then this person had rhythm fragmentation, which we correlated with psychomotor slowing in this sample. This is just a summary of the work that we've done so far, basically summarizing this section here. We have observational data showing sleep-wake rhythm disruption correlates with a host of poor outcomes. We've also shown that measuring actigraphy sleep-wake measures, those measures may be a moderator of depression treatment outcomes. So we wanted to develop an app, and we've made some progress in validating it technically. We published an initial proof of concept where we were kind of laying out the premise I just told you in sleep. I just mentioned these data. We have a couple more papers that'll come out in the next year or so where we showed we can get similar metrics, having people wear the Apple Watch and the Actigraph co-watch. So those metrics are coming out. Some of them are coming out exactly the same. And we did pilot it in dementia caregivers, 15 of them, where we actually gave them a 6-week behavioral intervention, and we used the data to adapt what we said to them each week. So the future for plans here is to evaluate in an RCT, is this type of monitoring really adding anything in practice? So I went through some potential unmet needs in particularly vulnerable populations, some potential solutions, approaches that we're taking and testing. As I've said, these tests are underway. We need to confirm things. But I do think this is promising because we've seen in the pilot studies that these types of targeted sleep-wake interventions can improve mood, at least in some people. We know that some people are going to benefit from this and have improved mood. And if we do this in large enough studies, we should be able to then determine which sleep-wake changes are mediating their antidepressant effects of these treatments. altogether, this kind of fundamental knowledge on which types of sleep-wake function can be modified and which can lead to improvements in depression, this may have applications for both prevention approaches, that is, identifying people at risk and mitigating that risk early, but also treatment approaches and potentially helping maintenance therapies. And so I'm thinking of new trials and things we can do with not just the behavioral interventions, but the monitoring type things and other things you can do on just an iPhone. And I think it's time that we kind of start moving on from this question of does it work? And instead we really work on this question of for whom it works. And to do that, we're going to need large trials. All right, that's all I had. Thank you very much for your attention. I know it was a lot. Hopefully we can have some discussion and some questions.
Great, Steve. Thank you very much. And it was really a pleasure hearing firsthand from you about some of the work that you're doing. While we wait for some questions to come in, I really want to come back to this notion of sleep-wake rhythms and its association with depression. And I think one of the things that's really striking about your data is the association between sleep-wake rhythms and suicide risk, and a less robust association with insomnia or in sleep complaints. And I'd really like for you to comment, if you can, on what is the mechanisms that you might uh, use to understand why there's a specificity with circadian rhythms and sleep rate disruption versus and suicide, as opposed to just simply insomnia.
Yes, thank you. That's really hard. I don't have a good answer to that. I can only speculate um, that the people who have sleep-wake rhythm disruption, most of them may also have insomnia, and it's sort of just this additional loss of the daytime activity engagement um, on top of it, and the addition of the circadian disruption. I mean, it's possible to have, even though circadian disruption contributes to insomnia, it's possible to have insomnia, but a relatively intact circadian system. And so what I really think might be happening is you have people who have insomnia, and then on top of it, they're no longer functioning during the daytime, and they start sleeping at all sorts of erratic times. And sleeping out of phase can really have, I think, direct effects on mood. And then you throw in the mix that you're missing out on a lot of daytime activity. I think the end result may be across multiple levels of analysis, insults, including social isolation. You're not integrated, you're not connected to other people. So you're getting that. You're getting this poor sleep at the wrong time that's bad for your mood. And then I think something that's of interest to you in particular is that I think we need more biological studies of the impact of circadian disruption because just like we have these data now showing us that kind of the restless REM sleep or sleeping out of phase can have direct effects on mood. I think the circadian disruption might have direct effects on mood too, for example, through disrupting your immunological profile. So we know that sleep and having sleep at regular times are closely intertwined with our immune system. And so there's just a lot of mechanism stuff in play that I'm just kind of throwing out there. And I think we need studies to really rigorously evaluate which is really driving this effect. So
Okay.
sort of
Thank
hand
you
it
very much.
off.
Thank you, Stephen. We have a couple of questions. The first one is from Diane Lee Luxembourg, and she asks, could this monitoring help vulnerable populations like military people before deployment to avoid poor sleep and possible depression, suicide risk, and understand how poor sleep and less activity in the AM can impact them negatively?
Right. I think so. I think we need trials to figure out who it works for, to identify individuals in screening. I think some people may benefit just from seeing the feedback of this is
Hmm.
really what my sleep-wake rhythm looks like. I mean, it's one thing to tell someone don't sleep between 6 and 8, have a regular wake time. It's another thing to then show them where they are currently with it. And so maybe just the monitoring will help some people or at least get them to treatment. I suspect many people really need the behavioral health coaching, behavioral sleep therapist approach as well. But certainly, if we had willing people who were doing this, say people who are going to be deployed, and you could look at their history of sleep, you might decide, well, okay, Jim's going to stay home. He actually hasn't slept. He's actually on an irregular schedule. It's not a good idea to deploy him. Let's see what's up.
Okay, thank you. The second question has to do with movement disorders in relationship to sleep and also the responses that you're seeing. And particularly people that are on antidepressants or antipsychotics often complain of akathisia and that it can cause a pseudo-Parkinsonism. So, and there's also evidence that akathisia can be linked to suicidality. So, can you discuss how how you might sort that out, and particularly to what extent you're obtaining in your measures movement information about their movement beyond just the simple measures of activity?
Right. I think this is a great area for future collaborations and things that we can work on together. I won't pretend to be an expert in this area, just to say that I think one of the main uses of this type of approach might be to track side effects. So if you're changing a medication, you're having somebody monitoring their sleep-wake pattern over time, and you change a medication, there may be some objective data in here that could be correlated with side effects, but I'm not aware of data that could be clear on that right now in terms of the role. What can we really detect with this? But I think it's a great question.
So this is going to be a challenging because most of your work has been focused on older adults, but can you comment on how sleep phase delay in adolescence contributes to depression and particularly bipolar disorder in that younger age population?
Yeah, I'd refer you to work from Peter Franzen and Tina Goldstein that is out and coming out. But they're doing the same thing. They're even using the TRAN-SC approach, which does incorporate trying to treat those delays. Um, But yeah, I think having a delay in adolescence, it's going to cause short sleep. Then they're going to have to make up for their short sleep by on the some days that they're going to have to wake up early, and then some days they're sleeping in, and you're going to end up with irregular rhythms. So I think these same factors are in play in younger adults. Absolutely.
So this goes back to, how we can understand what's going on in the general population and the really wide availability of commercial wearables, which are, they're used by so many people, but they also generate a lot of information for us to look at in the morning after we wake up and try to understand what's going on. So when you're working with patients, what data from these wearables that are commercially available is particularly helpful for monitoring sleep and subsequent depression risk?
Well, I took me a very long time, and I know many other people have tried to get the actual raw accelerometer data off of the Apple Watch. And it may have been a fool's errand. Maybe somebody will do a study and show you can just use the sleep or the steps that Fitbit or Apple Watch are just giving you in their native software. Maybe that's okay. For me, I was really interested in getting the raw epic by epic accelerometer data, validating that it's the same to the research devices, just because we know that the rhythm factors are important and they're not available. You could, though, in the interim, you could use my app. It's under development. You won't be able, you can download from the App Store, but you can't use it unless you're collaborating with me and I turn it on for you. That will give you raw epic by epic data and rest activity rhythm measures. If you don't want to do that, you can look at basically, I think the most important thing would be looking at the estimated sleep offset time, the time people get going every morning. And you can
Okay.
track their activity levels again, but be aware of the caveat that in older adults in particular, light steps are not capturing light activity. You're going to be missing a lot of activity if you're just looking at when they're taking steps. And don't, please, I'm sorry, don't the sleep architecture stuff, like the percent REM you're getting from your Fitbit, like please try to look at the data. I think the last accuracy I saw on that was like 63% for discriminating sleep stages. So my perspective, I could be a little out of date, is that you're not really, if you're trying to measure brain electrophysiology at the wrist, you're probably not doing it very well. So, but I do think, in terms of movement-based measures you get from these, yeah, you can get the accelerometer data. You can already roughly see when people get going, is at the same time every day or not.
So we know that light exposure has a very important role in regulation of circadian rhythm disturbances, and we also know that uh, light exposure can actually be very helpful in the treatment of depression. And this is a question that I have, and that is, has there been studies that have integrated the use of the Actilume for the measurement of light exposure with activity? And particularly, I'm interested in the issues, what's going on with this morningness phenotype, and to what extent it is really activity or simply light exposure that's driving these benefits, which could often just go together. I saw in many of your photographs and people talking about getting out of bed, which also means they're getting out of their dark room and going outside and taking their walks. So, go.
Absolutely. It's one of the things that I hope we can answer with my ongoing trial. That is, when we get people more activated in the morning, a lot of things are going to change. Which one of these are really accounting for the antidepressant effect? I also think it's going to be really hard to disentangle because it's all happening at the same time. But
Mhm.
you could imagine some studies where you are disentangling that, and absolutely light. I think it has huge effects, both direct and indirect, on mood.
Okay.
Morning light.
No- Another question from the audience, and this is from Donna Ames, and she has a question about the impact of sleep apnea on activity. And current sleep apnea technology utilizes apps and monitors breathing disruptions, and to what extent that's been integrated into the work that you're doing or that of others.
Right. So in sleep apnea, you're likely to have daytime sleepiness. It's one of the biggest effects. And so I haven't actually seen much work looking at rhythms and sleep apnea, but I totally agree. Sleep apnea probably it's fragmenting sleep, and it's very plausible that you're going to be reducing activity and disrupting rhythms as well. So it may be useful.
Any other questions? I have a slew of other questions, but I do want to bring up one more thing. I was very intrigued by this notion that consolidation of REM sleep is causally related to distress, and predicting distress. What are the techniques that one could use to consolidate REM sleep?
So I think the way I think of it is, if you wake up and you want to go back to sleep, but you're kind of having this nocturnal mentation where your brain starts going. I don't know how many of you have kind of like woken up and like started writing an email in your head or something. Just get out of bed. So my strategy is just eliminating the possibility for fragmented REM sleep by getting up at that first awakening. I think that Rick Wassing and Usman Summerin might have some nice review papers out there talking about the biomechanisms involved here. But essentially, it's the same thing if you were to have fragmented sleep in the beginning or the middle of the night. Like, you don't want to be having that distress and sleep stuff happening at the same time.
Got it. Thank you. That's really helpful when I'm talking with my patients. One last question, and that is, there's been a lot of effort to try to use some combination of pharmacotherapy with CBTI to look at response, mixed findings, and also look at likelihood of remission. Are you aware whether Allison Harvey or other groups have actually looked at trans-C and treatment response or protection from remission in patient populations?
So specifically with depression,
Yeah, in transit with transit.
yeah, I'm not sure. I think that no, I think we're gonna have to wait.
We'll have to pioneer that ourselves. Okay, this is great, Steve. Any other questions from the audience? I don't see anything else coming in. So thanks a lot, Steve, for giving us a great presentation today. I learned a great deal, and I look forward to seeing you at other meetings, and particularly the American Association of Geriatric Psychiatry meeting that's occurring this coming week, this coming weekend in Phoenix. So
Thank
hope
you.
for many of you from the gero psychiatry community will be attending that meeting. All
Hope
right.
to see you there. Thank you much. It's my privilege.
All right. Bye bye, Stephen. Bye.
Bye.